Good morning. How many of you have ever had an interview and when you walked out of it, you wished you'd prepared a little better?
Always.
All right, we're in the right place. There's one chair up here. Whoops. Somebody wants to sit there and here? Second one, let's see. Second one down.
Second one, here?
That one, yep. There we go. And is there a clicker I can use? All right. We are going to talk today about the most powerful way to prepare for an interview. It's going to take three different perspectives on that. One is the attitude you go in with. One is the preparation you can do. And the third is all you can do on the day of the interview. So let's dig right in to attitude. Our attitude toward others determines their attitude toward us, doesn't it? Have you ever walked in and felt like you were begging for an interview, where you felt very unequal with the interviewers? They sense that, don't you? But if you could go in with an attitude of, I'm going to interview them to see if they're a fit for me, just as they are going to interview me and see if I'm a fit for them, you can go in at a much more equal level. What else can affect your attitude? A huge piece of it is having a funnel of opportunities. If this is the only interview you've had all year, it's much more nerve-wracking than if you have been carefully surveying the opportunities in front of you and getting regular interviews for opportunities. So you've got a funnel, and when you see an opportunity that's a fit and you apply, then maybe you become one of the qualified applicants, and then maybe you get an interview, and then we get to reference checks and offers and negotiation and acceptance. And if you have some things at each of those levels, then there's a lot less anxiety about any one of the interviewers. So try not to put all the eggs in one basket. No? Focus on what you can control. Can you control whether or not you get a job offer? No. Can you focus on bringing your best self and being thoroughly prepared with the answers? Yes. So let's focus on what we can control. All right, let's jump into preparation. It's the bulk of what we're going to talk about today. Here are the pieces. Let's go through those one at a time. Let's start with analyzing the job posting, assuming there is a job posting. Sometimes you wonder how all of that description can be done by one person, don't you? But actually looking at everything they're asking for is the first step in preparing. Why? Because what they want, what they state they want. Now, mind you, how many of you have been hiring managers at some point? How many of you have ever put a job posting together? How many of you did it without cutting or pasting from another job posting? Right. The job posting, when you get in there, doesn't always match what the job is, does it? Because most people are lazy and will just cut and paste from something else as close as they can find. But it's still the best thing you've got to go on. So looking at all the pieces is a good place to start. Then we're going to project what the questions might be. Now, there are two kinds of questions. One of them is these kinds. Why should we hire you? And what are your passions? And what can you do for this company? And those are sort of projecting kinds of questions. They're not very effective because you can say anything. What's much more effective is behavioral questions. A behavioral interview question asks you how you behaved in a situation similar to the kind of situation you'll find in this job. And behavioral interviewing has been shown to be 55% predictive of future on-the-job behavior versus traditional interviewing is only 10% predictive. So you will find most forward-thinking companies will use at least partial behavioral interviewing. What does that mean? That means you get asked questions like, tell me about a time when you were on a group project that failed. What happened? What did you do? What were the consequences? What did you learn from it? So it's asking you to go back into your memory and talk about an actual incident, not project something or say what you think you want them to hear, but actually relive history for them. And that means you have to put together a story. How many of you are good storytellers? Not enough, huh? Interviewing successfully is a lot like being a good storyteller. And here's sort of a framework for putting your stories together. You start with the situation. I've been helping someone recently prepare for interviews, and he jumps right into what he did. And then later he tells me what the situation was. I'm like, oh man, that would have set up your story so much more powerfully. Start with the situation. Start with what the problem was, or what the barriers were, what the issue was that made it so challenging. Then indicate what you did, what needed to be done, what you specifically did. And sometimes a team does things, and it's okay to say what the team does, but it's also very important to articulate what you specifically did to contribute to that solution. Okay? And then, and people often forget this as well, what were the results? When you did that effort, how did things change? How did things get better? If they didn't get better, you might want to think about a different story. Right? This is your opportunity to tell the best stories of your career. You all have stories where you look like the hero. Those are the stories you want to tell in an interview. And so you can start from two different directions in this. You can start with the best stories you've got, right? The stories you love to tell people when you're introducing yourself to somebody. We've all got a few work stories where we smell like roses. Those are good stories to tell in interviews too, as long as you follow this kind of format and you think about what characteristics do these illustrate, right? Okay, so that's the bulk of interview preparation should be spent right here. Working out your stories in this kind of format. And I actually suggest you make a matrix. You go back to that job description, you highlight every experience they want you to have, every character strength they want you to have, every adjective of a task that they want you to do, and then one by one articulate a story that will illustrate you using that character strength, you getting that experience, okay? Even if the company does not do a behavioral interview, you can still answer a question with a behavioral story. So for example, if somebody says, you know, what would you do if a project failed? You can say, well, I actually had experience where projects failed. So let me sort of paint the picture for you. Here's what happened. And it strengthens your position with them, because nothing is as powerful as what you have already done in a similar situation. The more you can describe how you reacted in situations, the better they can picture you solving their problems in similar situations. The next thing you can do with interviewing is practice. It can be very useful to do that with a career coach who can give you feedback from all kinds of angles, but at least do it with each other. Do it with another job seeker. Do it with a friend. Do it with your spouse. Practice saying the words. Do it in front of a mirror all by yourself. But practice answering the questions. Practice speaking. We would never play a violin concert without practice. We would never perform in a play without practice. We are better off if we do not interview without practice. You can predict what some of the questions are going to be. Have people ask you those questions. And then we'll talk about what are the questions you can't predict? You always get those, right? If you could be any animal, what would you be? Practice. So the first thing is to take a moment. When you get thrown a loop, and if you can have some of your interview practice to be questions like this that you're not necessarily expecting, so that you get practice doing things you don't expect as well. Anybody in the room in a Toastmasters club? It's something I highly recommend. One of the parts of every meeting is called table topics. You get a question and you have to stand up immediately and give a 1 to 2 minute response. What is interviewing? You get a question you're not expecting, you get 1 to 2 minutes to give a response, right? So it's great practice in thinking on your feet and responding to questions you're not anticipating. But you can do, even if you're not in a Toastmasters club, you can do this with each other, right? You can play a table topics game at lunch in the conference room, right? You can say, okay, I've got a topic. Who wants to answer this one? And practice just thinking in a fluid way so that you can speak off the cuff. Because that's what a lot of interview is. Now, I suggest that you keep a matrix, a spreadsheet of your stories. And down one side, you've got all the experiences and characteristics that are called out in the job posting. And down the other side, you have the stories that work for each of those items. And that you have this prepared list of stories. And that when somebody asks a question, the first thing you can do is say, okay, do any of my stories address that question? And maybe they don't. But maybe there's one that's similar. Maybe they ask about a project that failed, and you could say, you know, I don't have a project that failed, but I do have an employee that failed. And if I can walk you through that process, maybe that gets to the core of what you're asking, right? Sometimes you can pretend you're a politician and answer the question you wish they'd ask. Especially if it's close, if it's related to the question they did ask. Sometimes there are gotcha questions. There are potentially triggering questions. And I strongly urge you to be prepared to answer those before you go in. By that I mean questions that might be, why did you get terminated from each of your jobs? Why do you have this gap in your resume? Tell me about the worst performance review you've ever had. Tell me about the biggest conflict you've ever had with your boss or with a coworker. Tell me, you know, those things that are really big challenges. Those are all fair game in interviews. And sometimes it doesn't matter what words you use to answer. It matters what happens in your body when you answer. Because if you flush and you get flustered and you start sweating, that shows to the interviewer. Getting triggered often means you get a burst of adrenaline. You want to flee, right? You want to fight or flight response with a burst of adrenaline, and that will flush your face and make your palms sweaty, and it will totally override the clear thinking parts of your brain. Not something you want to have happen in an interview. So think about those kinds of triggering things. On your handout is a list of potentially triggering questions. Don't be surprised by them. Think through how you will answer each of those before you go into the interview. All right, next step is to research. That means both researching the company and researching the people that you get to interview with, right? Most people you interview with will be on LinkedIn, and so you can at least find out what their job title is, and maybe what their responsibilities are, maybe where they went to college. maybe it's the same place you went to college and you've got a connection. Sometimes, I interviewed with somebody and said, how did it feel to be called the Wizard of Wharton? And he kind of looked like, because that had been several years ago, but there'd been a Forbes article on him. Like, wow, you did your research. It's impressive to someone when you use the available materials online and research their organization. Research the product that they're making. Research the competitors. Research any strategic information about where the company might be going. The more you know about the company and the people that you'll meet, the better questions you can ask, right? You don't want to ask questions like, what's your vacation policy? That's not an interview question. That can happen in HR. You want to ask questions that only this person could answer, or that's really uniquely relevant to you and the job. You got a question?
Yes, so the example you just gave us, right? So if I search for the interviewer's background, and I found out we came from the same university, right? And I mentioned this, oh, hey, we come from the same school. Will the interviewer feel like
Stalked?
Yeah, creepy, or will that counter-effective?
It's a great question, and I actually just had a client who said we did come from the same undergrad school, and so I said, hey, when's the last time you were back to visit or something? And he said he kind of reacted in a way that I wasn't sure it was a good idea to have brought up. Here's what I'm going to say. If it's in their LinkedIn profile, fair game. If it's on their Facebook page or in their private website or on their place of worship's website or their children's school's website, now you're really getting creepy. In general, when you search someone, LinkedIn is first, second, or third thing that comes up. And you might want to keep reading. I literally got a speaking gig once, and when I was introduced to the group, the person in charge said, this is Marcia Davis Cannon. I've read everything about her on the internet, and I decided she would do. People will, I encourage you to Google yourself and know what's on the internet about you. I was stunned at some of the things on the interview, on the internet about me. My mother's obituary was on the internet. Something that I wrote for an alumni organization event 15 years ago was still on the internet. Their poetry that I wrote in a grieving class was still on the internet. There are things that once they get on, they stay on for a long, long time. So know what's on there about you. And actually, sometimes you can get things removed. I had a client who had who had taught at a university and had a Rate My Professor review that was really awful. We were able to get it removed. So if there's stuff on there that might damage you, there are steps that you can take to get it removed. Any other questions? Does that answer your question? Anything else on that one? All right, so researching and then is one thing, and using the information is another thing, all right? So learn what you can. I had an interview once, and I was I had two people interviewing me, and I was third level on LinkedIn with both of them. And it won't tell you, it'll tell you who your first level is, but it won't tell you who the second level is when you're third level. So there was this missing gap. So I looked at who else I knew at the organization that they both worked at before this organization, and boom, I knew somebody, and I figured out who the second level was. So I called my first level, and she said, sure, I'll be glad to introduce you to that second level. So I got to talk to the person who had hired both of these people into this organization, into their previous organization, and learn all about them before I got interviewed by them. Now, I did not say that in the interview. I did not use most of that information, but it helped me know what I was walking into. So The more you can be prepared, the better. But be careful how you use it. And I think my other client's error was in asking how often he'd gone back, not in saying that they were both alumni, right? So that's a kind of a personal question: is how long, how often you travel somewhere. But hey, I see you're a golden bear as well, whatever. Okay? Let's keep going. Questions to ask. I actually knew somebody, and she said, I got to the end of the interview and they had answered every question I had written down, so I said, no, I don't have any questions to ask. She did not get the offer. You're asking questions at the end of an interview is actually one of the things they really look at. It's important that you have questions that are meaningful. And it really shows your interest in the job to ask questions. Anybody have a good question that they like to ask at the end of an interview? All right, here are some of mine. One of them, I especially like to ask the hiring manager, is something like, tell me about the people on your staff who are really thriving here, really doing well. What do they have in common? And whatever the answer is will tell you something about what that boss values. If they say, oh, they're really creative, that's a very different answer than they always show up on time. Right? So I like to get a sense of the values of the boss. I might ask, if you could design the perfect communication flow between us when I'm an employee, how often would you like to meet in person? What do you like to be copied on an email? How do you like to have a communication flow? And that tells me a lot about how they want to communicate together. I also will always ask for, is that still coming up? I will also always ask for feedback. Now, when you interview, if you don't get the job and you go back to HR and say, can you give me some feedback on my interview? The answer is almost always going to be no. But if in the interview, when you get an opportunity to ask questions, if you ask a feedback question, it's very bold. It's generally not expected. And every time I've done it, I have gotten feedback. So I've given you, again, on the handout, several things that you might ask. My favorite was always, I think this is a fabulous fit and I would just do terrific work in this role. Do you have any concerns about my performing very well here? And they will think and they'll say, well, I wish you, one of them said, well, I wish you were better connected. And I laughed. I said, oh my goodness, we haven't talked about a network at all. Let me tell you about my network. So I had an opportunity to immediately address the concern. Another one had a concern and I thought they're thinking, you are so right, and if that is important to you, this is so not the organization for me. So getting feedback on how you come across, in the moment, you're much more likely to get it, and then you can act on it. If you're getting interviews and you're not getting jobs, something's going on in that interview that you want to know about, you want to get feedback on, and this is your best opportunity to do it. Yes?
But when you go and ask them about their reservations, does that make it seem like you're not as confident about...
Oh, did you hear how I worded that question? That's a very gutsy, bold question. I think I will succeed brilliantly here. Do you have any concerns about my not succeeding brilliantly? I want to hear them. Or one of the questions is, could I just ask you how did this interview go from your perspective? I love feedback and I'm trying to improve my interviewing skills. I'd love to know how I could do this better. So in general, openness to feedback is a real strength, not a weakness. Yeah. Yes?
So on the feedback that you addressed about your, basically you can do it, do you get a job position or is for the next position that you can do?
Right, no, it depends. If you're able to address a concern in the moment, you might well be able to improve your chances of getting that job. But yes, it's in general improvement for going forward. Yeah. big picture? Everything I've talked about up till now is kind of a whole bunch of details. And when you're preparing for an interview, it can be easy to get lost in those details. You're putting all these stories together, you're thinking about all these characteristics you need to meet. Stop and look at the whole job and the preparation that you're doing and think about what is the big picture here. If I had to summarize 3 points, what are the 3 most important things I want to communicate to this interviewer today? Maybe it's that I fit this job because of this particular experience. Maybe it's that I have this particular characteristic. Maybe it's that, I have this particular passion. I don't know what the 3 things are going to be for you, but I strongly encourage you to step back and say, I've got hours of data here. I cannot communicate all of this in 1 hour in an interview. What is most important? What do I need to make sure comes across? And if you figure out those 3 things, then if they open with a softball, like, tell me about yourself, you can tell them about yourself highlighting those 3 things. At the end, when they ask if you have any questions, you can say, I have several questions, but I just want to summarize real quick what I am more convinced than ever that I'm an amazing fit for this role, and I just want to summarize the 3 things that I think are most important, cementing that fit. So do all your detailed research, but then step back and look at what's the big picture, what's the most important. All right, it's the day of the interview. You ready? You've done all your research, you've done all your practice, you've got all your stories ready. Here we go. Arrive early. You know there can be traffic. You know there can be accidents. You know that you can be heading out the door and the phone rings and it's something terrible. Plan to be early. I once had an interview in Milpitas. I live in Mountain View, and the Dunbarton Bridge was closed that morning. It was clear. I pulled out of, I'd driven a block and I couldn't even get on Grant Road. It was all backed up. It's like, this is not good. And traffic was crawling on 237 because everybody who usually went over the Dunbarton Bridge was down here. I did not make it to that interview on time. And I called them immediately and was able to tell them, but it doesn't serve you well not to be on time. And so to the extent that you can control it, you want to be early, and to the extent that you can, I wouldn't go in. I would not go in until about 10 minutes before, maybe 15 minutes before you go in and find the bathroom and do the power posing, right? You know this one, don't you? On your handout is a link to a TED Talk done by a Stanford professor, Ann Cuddy, who has done research on how when you change your body posture, the chemicals in your body change. And literally, when you do a power pose, and that's being large, getting your hands out, your legs apart, occupying space, it actually increases the testosterone, which is the dominance hormone in your body, and reduces the cortisol, which is the stress hormone. What do we usually do when we go in for an interview and we sit in the lobby and we cross our legs and we cross our arms and we kind of look small? We are increasing our cortisol and the stress hormone while we sit there. So think large. Tall posture occupies space. Now, you don't want to put your feet on their desk. That's the wrong message. But you do want to occupy the chair. You don't want to cross your legs. You don't want to cross your arms. Use up space. Know that from the minute you pull onto their property, you're being watched. People have lost jobs because they were rude to the receptionist. Be polite and pleasant to everyone you meet. stand out from the crowd in a positive way, not in a negative way. So let's talk about body language. You don't have to be clean shaven, but you certainly want a warm smile. You certainly want to exude confidence. Yeah, and the formal dress is a little, not for most of the companies in Bay Area, but you want to dress one level above the way they dress, right? So if they're dressed in t-shirts and blue jeans, then you might want to wear a shirt with a collar and nice blue jeans. But you want to be one level above them. Firm handshake, you don't want to be wet fish. You also don't want to overpower them the way my father used to do when I brought boyfriends home. And you want to have some good posture. Let's look at posture. That is a big difference, isn't it? Who do you want to hire? I had a physical therapist once who said, think of lifting your heart. Isn't that a beautiful image? I want you each now to sit in your chair while lifting your heart. That automatically puts you into a beautiful posture. Listen. I once had an interview, this was at Stanford, and the guy asked me one question and then he pushed my resume away and said, this is going to be more interesting if we just have a conversation. What do you want to know? Now, I had 3 or 4 questions prepared. I did not have an hour's worth of questions prepared. So I asked him the first question on my list, and I listened. And then I used a technique called threading. Are you familiar with threading? Which is I took some words out of his response and asked a follow-up question out of what he said. And that's how you do a conversation, right? You listen and you pull out something they said and ask another question or tell a story. Sometimes it was like, I've had an experience like that too. And I could tell a story. And we spent the hour that way. And at the end of the hour, he said to my potential hiring manager, if you don't want to hire her, I do. So, listening and being able to carry on a conversation. Sometimes, I've got a client right now, and they've got 3 people interviewing him, one person taking him for a coffee chat. And he's like, coffee chat? What does that mean? It's more like a conversation then. And so, having good conversational skills and listening well and then threading, thinking about, you can't be in your head thinking, what am I going to ask next? What am I going to ask next? You got to be present and listening. And then when the person stops talking, think about of what he said or she said, what would be most interesting to move forward with. And then you got to execute on everything you just practiced. You want to reflect your understanding. You want them to know that you understand what it takes to do this job because you've already done all the pieces. And you can tell stories about having done all the pieces. Let those stories showcase your skill. We often in the business talk about not making claims, but giving evidence. Think about your resume and particularly your interview in terms of what's the evidence that would be completely convincing that I have this skill. So it's not saying I'm a people person, that's a claim. But it's saying I got a bonus 5 years running from the sales team because I responded so beautifully to what they said, what they needed. Okay? Give evidence. I've actually, many times I've used for clients, it's like, have you ever gotten a letter of commendation or something like that? And then we'll pull a snippet of that and put it in the resume or in the cover letter, where it's not them bragging about themselves, it's their client or their boss bragging about them. Commending them for what they've done. It's lovely to have somebody else say nice things about you. however difficult it is to be on the job seeker side of the desk, it is at least as difficult to be on the hiring manager side of the desk. And the cost of hiring wrong is very high. That is why when somebody knows somebody, they have such an edge in getting the job. There's a reduction in risk when somebody actually knows somebody. So when you're hiring, when you're job seeking, the first place you can think about is who already knows how good I am. And where are they working? Let me get in touch with them and see if they know about opportunities, because they could speak about me in a convincing way. Right? That's your strongest first connection. And everything you do, you want to be reducing the employer's potential risk in hiring you, and telling the stories that show that you have solved the kinds of problems that they have. Part of that research you want to be doing is everything you can find on what the company's problems are. Because nobody hires people if they don't have problems. You got to be a problem solver, and you got to know what problems they have in order to know how you can solve them. You want to present the evidence that you've solved those similar problems, and you want to ask thoughtful questions. All right, takeaways. We're going to focus on what we control. We're going to practice answering the questions we can predict. We're going to reduce their risk in hiring us by showing how we've succeeded in solving similar problems. And we're going to do that all by keeping the big picture in mind. Second word? I think you can do it. And if I can be your partner, I love doing interview preparation with people and mock interviews and giving you feedback to help you be better and stronger. I'll be glad to do it. This is my website, uncoveryourcalling.com, and feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be glad to help.